Thank you. Minister, if ever there was an example of a budget that was preparing for an election, it is probably this, because it's short-term rather than long-term in its outlook, a very short-term. No hard decisions have been made here. It lacks foresight. It reminds me of some poetry by Seamus Heaney. You know, whatever you say, say nothing. Whatever you do, do nothing is what this budget is really doing. It's a budget that essentially is about making sure it doesn't upset people, particularly people who are perceived to be the core Fine Gael voters. So it is an election budget, but I have to warn you, Minister, that I think you've actually completely messed up. I think you've messed up on many fronts, but on one particular front, I think it is seismic and is going to follow you, and that is in the area of climate change. And I know you're worried about this, so I'm going to accentuate those worries. We've had a huge amount of social change in the last number of years. Social change has been brought about because the people of Ireland are actually ahead of politicians, ahead of many people in this House on many different issues. And Minister, the people of Ireland are ahead of the people in this House when it comes to climate change. As the father of young children, I can assure you there's an intergenerational thing going on here as regards education and the fact that we need to maintain our planet. And we need to maintain it for future generations, like my children, like your children. And what you've done today, in your lack of foresight and lack of measures, is you have let them down. And you've let them down, and I believe it's going to have consequences for our country at a scale that hasn't been seen before. It's going to have consequences for our children. And I think, politically and electorally, it's going to have consequences for you, and Fine Gael, and your colleagues in government. We're one of the few countries that has climate change legislation. But the failure to actually kick on from that and actually bring about measures to change behavioural activity is not going to go down well with the public, because they're ahead of us. They're ahead of us in the need to change. It's around us. It's facing into us this Friday with another storm coming. We've seen the changes in our weather patterns over the last number of years. They are up for this. Dare I say it, if you were actually to be directly political about this, they were actually conditioned towards it. But some of the lobbyists and some of the Fine Gael vested interest lobbyists were not. And the can has been kicked down the road to a detrimental stage, which I believe is going to have consequences for you. I think you've totally underestimated where people are at in relation to this issue. And not alone that, but working people are going to actually have to pay fairly significant fines into the future because of your lack of foresight. And the rubbish, absolute garbage that the Minister for Finance spoke about in his few words about putting in place plans and assessments in relation to the implementation of this is just what it is. Rubbish. Garbage. And to the naked political eye, anyone looking at this can see that you didn't have the capacity, you didn't have the political will to take on the most significant issue facing every generation after us, which is climate change. A couple of days after the UN report, the most detrimental UN report ever in relation to this issue, and our country, a country of perceived wealth, modern country, has just basically ignored it. That's the fact, Ceann Comhairle. And that's an indictment of this Minister and all his colleagues sitting at the Cabinet table. So workers will pay huge fines into the future. There was a lack of foresight in relation to the measures that could be brought forward. The Minister for trying to be everything else, bar the Minister for what he is, Minister Ross, didn't have any foresight in relation to climate change measures in his own department, outside of some measures in relation to changes for electronic vehicles, which are to be welcomed, but are actually quite limited if you go down through them because of the costs implied. No changes in relation to what is absolutely necessary in relation to rail transport for the changeover to transport of freight across this country. And then I look at other lobby groups who hang around Fine Gael at this time when it comes to haulage and everything else, and then I wonder about why climate change measures aren't being brought about. The lack of the actual total investment required in relation to water and waste. And why do I say that? Because to those who may not be aware, water and waste and the actual use of energy behind it is a major use of energy, and it needs to be modernised, and the scale of investment here will not do it. The whole issue of retrofitting isn't at the scale required. The investment in new technologies. We have so many companies in this country that are innovative when it comes to new technologies, clean tech, green energy. I support a place, Lachine Mine, which is advancing so much in relation to becoming a hub for green technologies and for the bioeconomy campus. But yet the measures aren't detailed enough to support these companies to address our issues in relation to climate change. You could have, as my colleague Sean Sherlock has advocated on numerous occasions, brought forward taxation measures for the use of single plastics, but you choose not to. So as another colleague of mine, Jan O'Sullivan, tweeted earlier, when it comes to climate change, your basic adage as a government is, Lord, make me good, but just not yet. Why is that? Because you wouldn't make the hard decisions, because you can't bear to think possibly of the consequences, but you're wrong. Fine Gael like to also say that they're being responsible in this budget, so I'd like to nail this. The rainy day fund, when it's raining outside, isn't actually being very responsible. When we have so many issues that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have stated quite publicly in relation to health and particularly housing. But you're also not being responsible on the fiscal side, because you're borrowing from next year's fiscal space for welfare measures and tax cuts. And when you dig into the detail, that's exactly what you're doing. That's not what the people expected. You're borrowing on the basis of the space next year. Yes, you're talking about balancing the books, but you won't borrow for the much needed investment, much of which I've spoken about already. I want to go through income tax and the USC changes and explain these new figures. A worker on the minimum wage, assuming the new level of $9.80 an hour, and working full-time 39 hours a week, will earn approximately €19,500 annually. He or she will gain €7.82 from the US changes, but nothing from income tax changes. Minister, that is the equivalent to 15 cents per week. That is what you are giving people on minimum wage. Let me repeat that. To everybody in this House, people on the minimum wage are getting 15 cents a week. Do you understand that? That's 2 slices of Brennan's bread a week. And this is a fair and balanced budget. You might get off your phone if you don't mind. A worker on the living wage of $11.90, working 39-hour week, will earn around $24,500 annually. She will gain €20.32 from the US changes, but nothing from income tax. This is the equivalent to 39 cents per week, or in their case, 5 slices of Brennan's bread. So fair play to you, 5 slices of Brennan's bread to anybody who's on the living wage. A worker on an annual income of $35,000 is just below the threshold to pay the higher rate of income tax. he or she will gain €136.57 a year from the USC changes, but nothing from income tax, equivalent of €2.62 a week, or the price of a cup of coffee, which I referenced here last year. A worker on an annual income of €45,000 annually will gain €221.57, the equivalent of €4.26 per week. And a worker on an annual income of €70,500 annually, a high earner, he or she will gain €284.18, an equivalent of €5.47 a week. So, Minister, do you see how skewed it is? From the person on the minimum wage to the person earning over earning $70,500. That's why this is not a fair budget. That's why this isn't balanced. And the CNAG had a very good report recently in relation to the fact that the richest residents in the state pay less tax than those on the industrial wage. And here we have this accentuated by the measures being introduced in this budget. People on low incomes, people on average industrial wage deserve better. They deserve fair taxation. Work must pay, but they'll not be treated fairly by this government. When it comes to health, as my colleague Joan Burton said earlier on, we all fell over when, a little over a week ago or so, the Minister for Finance just stumbled across $1 billion, just happened to fall out of the couch. No one knew about it. So I was expecting significant progress in relation to a whole range of areas on health. But let me commence by saying, as a state and as a country, we now have a situation where, between the funding having to be provided now and the $700 million of extra funding that had to be found as regards the current budget, that's $1.9 billion that has had to be found for health spending. This can't go on. There has to be accountability for budgetary management in health. It's never ending. It's not a case do we expect an overspend in health. It's a case of how many $100 million is there going to be needed as a supplementary each year. The administration of the health service at the highest levels is the worst I have ever seen. And the overspend even went as far as their new home, as we found out in the last week. When it comes to Sláinte Care, the allocation, and I helped draft that report, which is a cross-party report amongst us all in here, of the allocation simply don't go anywhere near enough. When it comes to the capital and the area of acute services, we all know we need bed provision. We all know we need new wings in South Tip General and in UL in Limerick and in Drogheda and everywhere else. And we all know that they need to be timely. But I have a deep concern that they're not going to be built in the timeframes offered in relation to how these projections have been put forward. But also, I have a deep concern that we're losing our time in relation to the very important national maternity strategy. There doesn't seem to be the provision, if you break down in the figures, for the level of investment that's required there. I have to say I do welcome the support being given for HPV testing in the whole area of cervical cancer and cervical check. I'd like to remember Emma Vic Mahoney today. And I welcome the moves in relation to the Section 39 workers in relation to pay restoration. They're something we support. But let me be quite clear. I don't see how this budget is going to deal with the issues in relation to primary care. And geographical coverage in primary care simply does not exist. There is a crisis in relation to the provision of staff across health. There is a crisis in relation to development of community intervention teams, in relation to OCs, in relation to physiotherapists, in relation to psychotherapists, and there is real issues in relation to how the backlog of assessments is going to be dealt with. There is provision in this budget to somehow deal with the backlog of assessments, particularly for children who have needs. But I just don't see how the staff are going to be provided to be able to even do that. And that's not being addressed. We have a provision of 55 million in relation to mental health, which is to be welcomed. But again, it's not pushing forward the vision for change at the pace that was expected a number of years ago. An example, in my own county of Tipperary, there isn't one, not one mental health bed in the county. I think the Minister completely underestimated where he's going in relation to the GP contract. Negotiations have belatedly, supposedly, started. But the provisions here in relation to the GP contract are far more than what is being budgeted for. I also have a concern in relation to the provision of the funding on disabilities. There is very little specific detail in relation to how it's going to be used. Are we going to just throw it out into the Section 38, 39 organisations and let them pull at it and use it as they see fit? Or is it going to target the very needs of people that we all know are there across a whole range of areas? I'm absolutely exasperated on pushing for the last number of years the need for further investment in home care and home care packages. And I welcome the additional budgetary measures here. They don't go far enough. There's common sense to this. The more people we can keep in their homes through these packages, the less costly it is going into nursing home care. The less costly it is then going into acute care. But we need to ensure that these packages are targeted. And we're going to hit the old chestnut of not being able to provide the staff to be able to deliver these packages. I have a couple over the road who have 30 hours a week, but they can only get 10 because the staff simply aren't available. That's a real issue. I welcome the provisions in relation to e-health. However, it is not enough. We need to ensure that the issues that we're facing, particularly in the acute side, because of the lack of good technology, are being addressed at a speed commensurate with the problems that we have. Extra funding for the NTBF is a bailout for the fact that our health services aren't working. It is a bailout that's been given to private healthcare because of the fact that our public health system is in such a mess. It is nothing else. It is short-termism, and it's repeated year on, year after. And here it is again. Moving on to childcare. I welcome the proposals in relation to the affordable childcare scheme thresholds that they're to be increased. However, it does need greater clarification. It needs greater clarification in order to understand these schemes, what one has to do to qualify. For instance, does the family have to be in receipt of a payment from the Department of Social Welfare? And more importantly, the changes that are being brought about, it does very little for two working people, a couple working together, or a couple working who have childcare needs, who will go over these thresholds. It does very little for them, if nothing for them. Real issue in relation to childcare, which my colleague Sean Sherlock has referenced numerous times, is to ensure that childcare workers are paid enough. And going to a payment of a living wage of $11.90 for all staff in the sector, I think, would have been a good move, which has been ignored again. In the whole area of childcare, the issue in relation to parental leave and how it's been dealt with in this budget is something that is quite unusual, Minister, because the 2 weeks paid parental leave, guess what? They're actually coming in after the next budget. Yeah. So why in the name of God are they being announced in this budget? They're coming in November 2019. So they're not going to have any impact between the time whoever stands up here after the next election at the next budget and now. They'll have no impact. So why are they being announced? Votes. Exactly. Votes. Well, lack of votes. When it comes to education, it's very disappointing. I don't think the Minister has got his slice of the pie for whatever reason. He needs to come in and explain it. There is only an additional 119 million in funding, or less than 1% of the budget, for education. When you strip out the increases of demographics, pay agreements and the already announced capital plan, there's only an extra 119 million in resources for education. Across a budget of 10.7 billion, this is less than a 1% increase, which completely and utterly makes a mockery of the Minister's claims of a 6.7% increase in funding, as extra money was already allocated to hire more teachers and support staff to cover a growing population. It's called demographics. So the public who are watching, you're being misled if you believe there's a 6.7% increase, because in reality it's less than 1%. There's no additional funding to reduce the pupil-teacher ratio at primary or secondary level, as my party proposed in our budget submissions. And there's no extra funding to genuinely deliver free school books scheme, which would have cost 40 million. At higher level, they're not listening as well, as the government haven't addressed the issue of student grants or reduced the student contribution in any way. And Minister, we have a crisis in our primary schools. I've raised it inside here in the Dáil. Of all the schools where there are working principals across the country, it is unsustainable for them to actually work 5 days a week and also ensure that last year 43 circulars were implemented. They deserve to have 1 day of administration and they deserve that to be part of this budget. I see there's 1 million being allocated for, in inverted commas, leadership. I hope that goes some way to addressing that, because otherwise I can guarantee you'll see him outside the gates. In relation to the spending and capital in education, I have a serious concern in relation to the 95 large-scale projects that have been put forward, because the Minister, through a sleight of hand, released new plans for new schools, which were welcome over a year or so ago. But the allocations that were given by Jan O'Sullivan a number of years ago, in many cases, haven't commenced yet. So where are they? I cite Colosh de Pobble in Rossgray, probably the largest school in my county, as an example of one of them. In relation to rural Ireland, we have the Town and Renewal Scheme, the 53 million, which is to be welcome. But really it's tokenistic if you divide it out. It's tokenistic towards rural Ireland. And this department, which is kind of a bit of a makey-uppy department, to be honest with you, really isn't going to have the impact in rural areas that it should have, because it doesn't have direct budgetary lines to be able to do that. We also need, I believe, that we need to have considered and targeted grants and tax measures to ensure that we have viable businesses and communities in rural areas. When it comes to transport, tourism and sport, the Minister, who's absent without leave, 40 million for new roads, pavements across the country. So if you average that out across local authorities, it's pretty paltry, given the cost of roads, given the cost to do pavement repairs. Maybe we need to improve a few of these pavements because we'll be pounding them again in a few weeks, I presume. But it's paltry, Minister. And anyone who goes running around saying that this money is going to solve the issues in relation to the rural roads that I know are in your constituency and my constituency is only actually deceiving people. In relation to travel behaviour, I've already spoken in relation to Irish Rail. The measures in relation to smarter travel, we have money for greenways, I acknowledge that. It's not enough in my opinion. But areas in relation to smarter travel, to deal with the issues I spoke about in climate change, to deal with the issues in relation to carbon, are simply not there to the level required. Regional airports, again, the lost connectivity, which isn't getting its fair bang for the buck in this budget. And may I just speak about the VAT on tourism and the change to 13.5%. I thought there would be some commensurate measures in this budget to help with the small, family-owned restaurants and businesses that are going to be negatively affected in rural areas, in West Limerick, in North Tipperary, in Wexford and everywhere else, Galway, Sligo. How are we going to ensure that these remain viable in this sudden change? What has the government done or proposing to do to ensure that happens? The answer is nothing. In relation to justice, There is no way that the budget that's been given to justice can ensure that the 50 recommendations of the Commission on Policing can be implemented. It is impossible over the timelines that have been put forward by the Commission on Policing. And after all the things we've learned about policing and justice in this country, surely the government should take that seriously. I note that there is no increase or no provision in relation to what is absolutely needed across Ireland when it comes to the use of ICT and, in particular, CCTV to decrease crime levels. On business, I welcome the development of 10 million for IDA property portfolio. I suggest, though, Minister, it has to be very much targeted and cannot follow the lines of this 2040 strategy, which is a complete joke and needs to be absolutely shredded. When it comes to housing, it is absolutely incredible that the measures introduced in relation to landlords are doing the following. And again, so the public aren't deceived. The changes in relation to interest that can be deducted by landlords for loans, changes up to 100%, means that effectively that landlords now are in a better position to buy property and buy houses than a working couple. So a guard and an IT worker, or a nurse and a teacher, a landlord is being incentivised by this change and is in a better position financially to actually buy a house than those couples. That's a fact. That's reality of this budget. And is it any wonder that one of the first organisations to come out and welcome the budget today and welcome this change was the Irish Property Owners Association? If there's ever an example of Fine Gael targeting their core base, there it is. Affordability. We've heard a lot of talk from Fianna Fáil as well on this in relation to what's been brought forward. We haven't detailed. 40 to 50,000. How are we going to ensure that this subsidy isn't just put on the top of the price of a house? How are we going to ensure that happens? What is there in this budget, Count Corla, for renters? For people who are renting? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Where is the indexation to CPI? Nowhere to be seen. We need a mass injection of capital in housing, which we have proposed. We need CPO powers for the local authorities. We need the Kinney report implemented, and we need CPI on rents. That's what we need in housing, and it hasn't happened. And to show, really, the mockery of what has been going on through this budget, the greatest example of this, the greatest example of why we do need to get out from underneath this government and end up in that general election, which I believe this is preparing for, is the example of the granny flat. The famous granny flat from Minister Ross and his Independent Alliance. This infamous granny flat that he has espoused so much.
The flat, not grannies.
And he's just announced that it is still in the pipeline. And it's going to be in the pipeline because they're going to test it out and make sure it's viable. They're going to test it out, Count Corla, on one property.
Very good.
One property. And you know what? I have a funny feeling it's being rat down.
Thank you very much.